At Christmas dinner, my daughter-in-law handed me a bill for my meal. I paid it without a word. 3 weeks later, a lawyer opened a folder that changed everything. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story travels. Christmas had always been my favorite time of year. Even after Franklin passed away 4 years ago, I still decorated my little colonial house in Columbus, Ohio, exactly the way we used to. The wreath on the front door, the white lights around the porch railing, the old wooden nativity set Franklin carved by hand when Garrett was still a boy. Some traditions feel too precious to abandon. At 71, I no longer hosted the giant family Christmas gatherings I once did. The responsibility had slowly shifted to my son and his wife. Vanessa loved hosting. She loved the expensive table settings, the coordinated decorations, and the carefully staged family photos that always found their way onto social media before dessert was served. Still, I was grateful to be included. Or at least, I thought I was. That Christmas Eve, snow drifted softly across the neighborhood as I wrapped the final presents for my grandchildren. Sophie's gift sat beside Caleb's under a silver ribbon. I smiled as I imagined their faces. Teenagers pretend they don't care about gifts anymore. They're usually lying. By 4 o'clock I was dressed and ready. I wore a dark green sweater Franklin had always liked, and a pearl necklace he'd given me on our 35th wedding anniversary. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. The wrinkles were deeper now. The silver in my hair had completely won its battle, but I still looked like myself. And for a moment, I felt almost happy. Garrett's house sat about 20 minutes away. When I arrived, the driveway was already full. Cars lined both sides of the street. Laughter spilled through the windows. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon greeted me before I even reached the front door. For a brief moment, I felt exactly what Christmas was supposed to feel like: home. The kind of smile real estate agents use when they're selling a property. Merry Christmas, Lorelei. Not Mom, not Lorelei, dear, just Lorelei. I barely noticed it anymore. Hello, Vanessa. She stepped aside. Everyone's already here. Inside. The house glowed with warm lights and holiday music. My grandchildren hugged me. Sophie held on a little longer than usual. Garrett kissed my cheek distractedly while checking something on his phone. The evening moved forward. Dinner was served. Stories were shared. Wine glasses clinked. At least on the surface, everything looked perfect. But something felt off. I couldn't explain it. Not yet. Every time I spoke, Vanessa seemed eager to redirect the conversation. Every time Sophie tried including me in a family photo, Vanessa somehow rearranged people before the picture was taken. Small things, easy things to ignore. The kind of things people dismiss as misunderstandings. So I did. Because that's what mothers do. We explain away behavior that would hurt us if it came from anyone else. Dinner eventually came to an end. The plates were cleared. Dessert had been served. I was halfway through a slice of pecan pie when Vanessa suddenly stood. She tapped her fork lightly against her glass. The room quieted. I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight. Polite smiles appeared around the table. She continued. As you all know, hosting these holidays gets more expensive every year. Several guests nodded. I wasn't paying much attention. Not yet. Then Vanessa reached into a folder sitting beside her chair. A folder. At Christmas dinner. My stomach tightened. She began handing envelopes around the table, one by one. People laughed nervously. A few looked confused. Finally, she stopped beside me and placed an envelope directly in front of my plate. I looked down. My name was written neatly across the front. Lorelei Blackwell. The room felt strangely quiet. I opened it. Inside was a printed invoice, a detailed bill. My portion of Christmas dinner, turkey, dessert, beverages, even the dinner roll. The total came to $84.73. For a moment, I simply stared, certain I had misunderstood. Then I heard a small chuckle from somewhere across the table. I looked up. Nobody seemed shocked. Nobody seemed offended. Nobody even looked surprised. That hurt more than the bill itself. Vanessa smiled. We thought it would be fair if everyone paid their share this year. I slowly turned toward Garrett, my son, the little boy who once cried because he thought I'd worked too hard making Christmas dinner. The man I'd spent my life protecting. He wouldn't meet my eyes, and suddenly, I understood. This wasn't Vanessa's idea alone. I folded the invoice carefully, reached into my purse, and wrote a check. No arguments, no tears, no scene, just silence. Vanessa looked disappointed, as if she'd expected a fight. Instead, I handed her the check and smiled. Merry Christmas. 3 weeks later, a man named Theodore Mercer called me and asked if I could come by his office. What he showed me that afternoon would change everything I thought I knew about my family. The drive home felt longer than 20 minutes that night. Snow drifted across the windshield in slow, silent waves while Christmas music played softly through the radio. I turned it off after the second song. I couldn't listen to another cheerful voice singing about family, not after what had just happened. The check I'd written for $84.73 wasn't what bothered me. At 71 years old, I could afford a dinner. What hurt was the message attached to it. For the first time in my life, I had sat at a family Christmas table and felt like a customer, not a mother, not a grandmother, not family, a customer. The streets of Columbus were almost empty by the time I pulled into my driveway. My little house stood quietly beneath a layer of fresh snow. The porch light glowed against the darkness. For a moment, I simply sat inside the car. The engine hummed softly. My hands rested on the steering wheel. I wasn't crying. The tears had never come. Instead, I felt tired. The kind of tired that settles deep into your bones. The kind that has nothing to do with age. The silence greeted me immediately. I removed my coat and hung it on the same hook Franklin had used for years. His old winter scarf still hung beside it. I never moved it. Some people said it wasn't healthy to keep reminders of someone who was gone. Maybe they were right. But after 43 years of marriage, you don't erase a person just because time passes. I walked into the living room. The Christmas tree glowed in the corner. Presents that hadn't been opened yet sat beneath its branches. Sophie's gift, Caleb's gift. I had forgotten to give them the larger packages. Everything had happened so quickly after dinner. I lowered myself into my favorite chair and stared at the tree. 4 years earlier, Franklin would have been sitting across from me, reading a newspaper he wasn't actually reading, pretending not to watch me decorate, pretending not to notice when I moved the same ornament 3 times before I was satisfied. I smiled at the memory. Then the smile disappeared, because Franklin would have noticed something was wrong. He always did. "What's bothering you, Lori?" That was what he used to ask. Not because I told him, because he paid attention. I eventually carried my purse into the kitchen and began unpacking the leftovers Vanessa had sent home. A small container of turkey, a few spoonfuls of stuffing, 1 slice of pie. The portions seemed strangely calculated. Maybe I was looking for reasons to feel hurt. That thought stayed with me as I washed a single coffee mug and prepared for bed. Because that was what I had done for years. Made excuses. When Garrett forgot birthdays. When holiday invitations arrived at the last minute. When family photos appeared online and somehow I wasn't in them. There was always an explanation. A misunderstanding. Bad timing. An innocent mistake. At least that's what I told myself. I climbed the stairs slowly. Halfway up, I paused beside a framed photograph hanging on the wall. It had been taken 15 years earlier. Garrett stood between Franklin and me. Sophie was a toddler. Caleb hadn't been born yet. Everyone was smiling, real smiles. Not the kind people perform for social media. The kind that happen when people are genuinely happy to be together. I touched the edge of the frame. Sometimes I wondered when everything started changing. Not dramatically, not all at once. Slowly. Like a crack spreading across glass. Almost invisible until one day the entire surface gives way. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The sky was still dark. I made coffee and carried a mug to the dining room. The house was quiet, peaceful, yet something felt unsettled inside me. My eyes drifted toward the checkbook sitting on the counter. I thought about Vanessa again. Not the bill, not even the money. The expression on her face. She hadn't looked embarrassed. She hadn't looked uncomfortable. She had looked confident. As if she knew nobody would challenge her, as if she believed everyone at that table agreed with her. That thought hurt more than anything else. I was still sitting there when my phone buzzed. A text message. For a brief moment, I hoped it might be Garrett. Maybe he'd called after I left. Maybe he'd realized how wrong the situation had been. Maybe he wanted to apologize. Instead, the message came from Sophie, my granddaughter. The text was short. "Grandma, are you home? Can I stop by later?" I smiled for the first time since Christmas Eve. "Of course, sweetheart." A few seconds passed. Then another message appeared. This one was different. Much different. "There's something I think you need to know about what happened last night." I stared at the screen, my coffee suddenly forgotten. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether the bill at Christmas dinner had been only the beginning. Sophie arrived a little after noon. The snow had stopped sometime during the morning, leaving the neighborhood covered in a blanket of white. I watched from the kitchen window as her small blue sedan pulled into my driveway. Something about the way she climbed out of the car immediately caught my attention. She looked nervous. Not the usual teenage nervousness. Not embarrassment, not awkwardness. This was different. She kept glancing over her shoulder before walking toward the front door. By the time I opened it, she was already forcing a smile. "Hi, Grandma." "Hi, sweetheart." I hugged her. For a brief moment, she held on tightly. Much tighter than usual, the kind of hug people give when something is weighing heavily on them. I led her into the kitchen and poured hot chocolate into one of my Christmas mugs. The same mugs Franklin and I had used every December for years. Sophie wrapped both hands around the cup, but she didn't drink. She just stared into it, waiting, thinking, choosing her words carefully. She looked up. "I'm sorry about last night." I offered a small smile. "Thank you, honey." Her eyes immediately filled with guilt. That reaction told me more than her words. Teenagers are terrible liars, especially good-hearted ones. "You shouldn't have been treated like that." The room grew quiet. I sat across from her. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then Sophie took a deep breath. "Grandma." The bill wasn't a last-minute idea. I felt my stomach tighten. Not because I was shocked. Part of me had already suspected that. Still, hearing it confirmed felt different. "What do you mean?" She lowered her eyes. "I heard Mom talking about it weeks ago." "Weeks ago?" The words settled heavily between us. "Weeks?" Sophie nodded. "Before Thanksgiving." I stared at her. Thanksgiving. That meant Vanessa hadn't acted on impulse. She hadn't made a poor decision in the moment. She had planned it. Carefully. For over a month. What exactly did she say? Sophie hesitated. I could see the conflict on her face. Loyalty to her mother. Love for her grandmother. No child should ever be forced to choose between those things. But life doesn't always ask permission before creating impossible situations. Finally, she spoke. She said somebody needed to teach you that you weren't entitled to special treatment. The words landed harder than I expected. Entitled. I had spent decades helping my family, watching children, helping with down payments, funding college savings accounts, buying birthday presents, hosting holidays, and somehow I had become entitled. I folded my hands together beneath the table. Carefully, steadily. "Was your father there?" Sophie nodded slowly. "Yes." The answer hurt, even though I already knew it would. "Did he say anything?" Her silence lasted only a second. But it was enough. "No." I looked toward the kitchen window. The snow reflected sunlight so brightly it almost hurt my eyes. When Garrett was 7 years old, he broke a neighbor's window while playing baseball. I still remembered how frightened he had been. Franklin made him walk across the street, apologize, and pay for the damage using money from months of chores. "Doing nothing when something is wrong is its own kind of choice," Franklin had told him afterward. I wondered if Garrett remembered that lesson, because somewhere along the way, he seemed to have forgotten it. Sophie cleared her throat. There was something else. I looked back at her. She seemed even more uncomfortable now. "Grandma, Mom talks about you a lot." I laughed softly. "Most families do. Not like this." The smile disappeared from my face. Sophie looked miserable, but she continued. "She says you're costing Dad money." I blinked. "What?" "She says every time he helps you with something, it's money that should stay inside our household." I stared at her, trying to process what I'd just heard. The irony was almost unbelievable. Garrett rarely helped me financially. If anything, the opposite was true. Over the years, I had quietly contributed more than anyone knew. The down payment on their first home, emergency expenses, school tuition assistance, thousands of dollars, all given without conditions, without expectations, without keeping score. Yet somehow Vanessa had rewritten the story. In her version, I was the burden, the dependent, the drain. Sophie suddenly reached across the table and grabbed my hand. "Grandma, I don't believe any of it." Her voice cracked slightly. "I never have." For the first time that day, emotion threatened to surface. Not because of Vanessa, not because of Garrett, but because of Sophie. Because one person had noticed. One person had cared enough to tell the truth. I squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you." She swallowed hard. Then she said something that made my heart stop. "Grandma, I wasn't supposed to hear this." A cold feeling settled in my chest. "What weren't you supposed to hear?" Sophie looked toward the doorway, as if making sure nobody else was there. Then she lowered her voice. About 2 weeks ago. I heard Mom talking to Dad after midnight. I waited. They weren't talking about Christmas. My pulse quickened. They were talking about your house. The room suddenly felt much smaller, much quieter. What about my house? Sophie looked directly into my eyes. And what she said next changed everything. I heard Mom tell Dad that if things went according to plan, you'd be moving out before next Christmas. I didn't sleep much that night. After Sophie left, I sat alone in my living room, long after the Christmas lights on the tree had switched themselves off. The house was dark except for a small lamp beside my chair. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. Inside, my mind wouldn't stop moving. Over and over, I replayed Sophie's words. If things go according to plan, you'll be moving out before next Christmas. The sentence felt unreal, like something that happened to someone else. Not me. Not in my family. I had lived in this house for 37 years. 37 Christmas mornings. 37 summers. 37 years of memories built into every wall. Garrett had taken his first steps in the living room. Franklin had planted the maple tree in the backyard with his own hands. Every corner of the house carried a piece of our life. The idea that someone was already discussing my departure felt impossible. Yet the more I thought about it, the less impossible it seemed. Because once you stop making excuses for people, certain memories begin to look different, very different. The next morning, I found myself standing in front of an old photo cabinet in the hallway. I hadn't opened it in years. Inside were hundreds of photographs, birthdays, graduations, family vacations, Christmases. I slowly flipped through them. At first, I wasn't looking for anything specific, just memories. But eventually, I noticed something, a pattern. 5 years ago, I was in nearly every family picture. 4 years ago, after Franklin passed away, I appeared less often. 3 years ago, I was usually standing near the edge. 2 years ago, I was missing from several gatherings entirely. Last year, I was barely visible. The realization sent a chill through me, not because of the photographs themselves, because of what they represented. You don't disappear from family pictures overnight. You disappear gradually, one invitation at a time, one exclusion at a time, one excuse at a time. I remembered Emma's school concert. Vanessa had told me the wrong start time. I arrived after it was over. At the time, she apologized. She seemed sincere. I believed her. Then there was the 4th of July barbecue. I learned about it from social media after it happened. Vanessa claimed it had been spontaneous. Again, I believed her. Then there was Garrett's promotion party. The reservation was supposedly limited. Not enough seats. Yet later I saw photographs of neighbors, co-workers, and friends I had never met. Plenty of seats, apparently. Just not one for me. I sat down heavily on the sofa. My chest felt tight. Not from anger, from understanding. There is a particular kind of pain that comes when you realize something has been happening for years and you only just noticed. Every memory begins rearranging itself. Every explanation starts falling apart. Every excuse loses its power. I wasn't discovering something new. I was finally seeing what had always been there. Around noon, my phone rang. It was Darlene Bishop, my best friend for nearly 30 years. She immediately knew something was wrong. She always did. "Lorelei, honey, what's going on?" I hesitated. Then I told her everything. The bill. Sophie's visit, the conversation about my house. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Finally, Darlene spoke. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When was the last time Garrett visited you alone?" The question caught me off guard. I thought about it. A few months ago, maybe longer. I honestly couldn't remember. Darlene sighed. "That's what I thought." Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then she asked another question. "Has Vanessa ever encouraged him to spend more time with you?" I already knew the answer. No, not once. Every visit seemed scheduled around her convenience. Every holiday came with conditions. Every invitation seemed carefully managed. Darlene's voice softened. "Lorelei, I don't think this started with Christmas dinner." I looked toward the family photographs scattered across my coffee table. Neither did I. For the first time, I was beginning to understand that the invoice wasn't the insult. It was the announcement. A message. A declaration that my place in the family had changed. Or perhaps they believed it already had. Carried a box of old documents down from the attic. House records, insurance papers, property tax statements. Franklin always kept everything organized. The man labeled folders the way librarians organize books. I smiled despite myself. Some habits never stopped making me laugh. As I sorted through the paperwork, One folder caught my attention. It was thicker than the others. Much thicker. On the front, Franklin's handwriting appeared in black marker. Personal, important. I frowned. I didn't remember seeing it before. Slowly, I opened the folder. Most of the documents were financial records, investment statements, property documents, legal correspondence. Nothing unusual. Then a business card slipped out and landed on the floor. I picked it up. The name printed across the front immediately felt familiar. Theodore Mercer, attorney at law. I stared at it. The same Theodore Mercer who had called me a few days earlier. The same Theodore Mercer who wanted me to come to his office in 3 weeks. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. Because suddenly, Franklin's old folder and Theo's unexpected phone call no longer felt unrelated. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether my late husband had seen something coming long before I did. The business card sat on my kitchen table for the rest of the afternoon. I must have looked at it a dozen times. Theodore Mercer, attorney at law. The name wasn't unfamiliar. Franklin had mentioned Theo many times over the years. They weren't just attorney and client, they were friends. The kind of friends who called each other by their first names. The kind who played golf together on Saturday mornings and argued about college football every fall. Still, I couldn't remember the last time I'd spoken to him personally. Years, probably. Maybe longer. Yet somehow, only a few days after Christmas, Theo had called and asked to see me. And now I was holding a folder Franklin had labeled personal, important. The coincidence felt too large to ignore. I spent the rest of the day sorting through the documents. Most of them were exactly what I expected. Investment reports, property records, tax paperwork. Franklin had always been meticulous. Every paper clipped, every page dated, every folder labeled. Organization was his love language. By evening, I had nearly finished reviewing everything. Then I noticed something unusual. Several pages were missing. Not torn out, not damaged, simply absent. There were references to attachments that weren't there. Mentions of supporting documents that had apparently been stored somewhere else. I frowned. Franklin never misplaced paperwork. Never. The realization left me with more questions than answers. That night, I called Darlene. "You're overthinking again," she said. "I don't think I am. You found an attorney's business card. I found it inside a folder Franklin specifically marked important." Darlene laughed softly. "Fair point." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then her voice became more serious. "Have you told Garrett about any of this?" I immediately shook my head before remembering she couldn't see me. "No." "Good." The answer surprised me. "Good. Yes. Why?" Darlene hesitated. Then she chose her words carefully, "Because right now, you don't know who is on your side." The statement lingered in my mind long after we ended the call. I wanted to argue with her. I wanted to defend my son. But the truth was becoming harder to ignore. When Vanessa handed me that invoice, Garrett had said nothing. When Sophie overheard discussions about my house, Garrett had said nothing. Every road seemed to lead back to the same uncomfortable fact. Silence. My son's silence. The next morning, I decided to get out of the house. The walls felt too quiet, too full of thoughts. I drove downtown and stopped at a small coffee shop Franklin and I used to visit together. Some places never change. The same wooden tables, the same smell of coffee beans, the same elderly couples sharing breakfast. For an hour, I sat near the window and watched people pass by, normal people living normal lives. I found myself wondering how many hidden stories surrounded me. How many families looked perfect from the outside? How many weren't? As I prepared to leave, someone called my name. "Lorelei?" I turned. A tall man stood near the counter, mid-50s, gray at the temples, familiar. It took a second before I recognized him. "Russell?" He smiled. "Russell Hayes." The manager from the restaurant where Garrett and Vanessa had hosted Christmas dinner. What a surprise. We exchanged a few polite greetings. Nothing unusual. Then something in his expression changed. A hesitation, a discomfort. The kind people get when they're deciding whether to say something difficult. "You doing okay after Christmas?" The question immediately caught my attention. "Why do you ask?" Russell looked down briefly, then back up. I wasn't sure if I should mention this. My pulse quickened. Mention what? He shifted his weight. The invoice situation. I said nothing. Russell sighed. "I've worked in hospitality for nearly 30 years. His voice remained calm, professional. Most people don't realize how much staff notice. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. Russell, I overheard part of a conversation before dinner. The room suddenly felt smaller. My heart began beating faster. What conversation? He looked genuinely uncomfortable now. As I was checking table arrangements, I passed near a private room. I waited. Your daughter-in-law was speaking with someone. I could barely breathe. And? Russell's jaw tightened. She said something that bothered me. The pause felt endless. Finally, he spoke. She said that after Christmas, the real plan could finally move forward. I stared at him. The exact words Sophie had used echoed in my memory. The plan. Not an argument. Not a misunderstanding. A plan. Something deliberate. Something ongoing. Russell continued. I didn't know what she meant. Neither did I. At least not yet. But she seemed very confident. He looked directly at me, almost like she expected something important to happen soon. A chill ran through me. Because suddenly, Sophie wasn't the only person mentioning plans, or timing, or my future. The pieces still didn't fit together, but they were beginning to form a picture. And for the first time, I started wondering whether Christmas dinner had never been about $84.73. Maybe the invoice had simply been a test, a way to see how much humiliation I was willing to accept. And if that was true, I had a feeling something much bigger was coming next. The conversation with Russell stayed with me for days, not because he had given me proof. He hadn't. He'd only shared a few words he happened to overhear. But sometimes a single sentence can change the way you see everything. After Christmas, the real plan could finally move forward. The real plan, not a misunderstanding, not a family disagreement. A plan. Something organized. Something intentional. The problem was that I still didn't know what that plan actually was. By the first week of January, life appeared to return to normal, at least on the surface. The Christmas decorations came down. The neighborhood lights disappeared one house at a time. The holiday music stopped playing in stores. Everything looked ordinary again. Yet beneath that ordinary surface, something felt different. I had stopped making excuses. For years, whenever something hurt me, I immediately searched for another explanation. Maybe Garrett was busy. Maybe Vanessa didn't mean it that way. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe. The word had protected me for a long time. Now it was gone. And without it, the truth looked much clearer. On a Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. Garrett. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. Hello, sweetheart. Hi, Mom. His voice sounded unusually cheerful, almost forced. We exchanged a few minutes of small talk. The weather, the holidays, the grandchildren. Nothing important. Then he finally arrived at the real reason for the call. I wanted to talk to you about something. There it was. I waited. You know, the house is getting pretty big for one person. I closed my eyes. Not because I was surprised, because I wasn't. I had been expecting this conversation ever since Sophie told me what she overheard. Still, hearing it directly from my son hurt more than I expected. I managed just fine. I'm sure you do. The pause that followed felt rehearsed. As long as you're healthy. There it was again. Not concern. Positioning. The subtle suggestion that my independence had an expiration date. I remained quiet. Garrett continued. Vanessa and I were talking about some options. Options. Another carefully chosen word. What kind of options? A smaller place. I looked around my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd packed school lunches. Baked birthday cakes. Sat with Franklin during late-night conversations that lasted until midnight. A smaller place. As if memories could be measured in square footage. I'm not interested in moving. Another pause. Longer this time. Then Garrett laughed softly. We're just talking, Mom. But it didn't feel like talking. It felt like testing. Like someone dipping a toe into water before diving in. The conversation ended a few minutes later. When I hung up, I sat motionless at the table. Not angry, not shocked, just disappointed. Because for the first time, I realized Garrett wasn't being manipulated into these conversations. He was participating in them. Maybe reluctantly. Maybe uncomfortably, but willingly. That realization changed something inside me. Later that evening, I opened Franklin's folder again. The thick folder marked personal, important. I reviewed every page more carefully than before. Line by line, page by page. Halfway through the stack, I noticed something I had missed. A reference. Just one sentence, buried inside a document. It mentioned a trust review meeting. The date was 3 months before Franklin's death. The trustee listed was Theodore Mercer. My pulse quickened. I read the line twice. Then, 3 times. Trust. The word appeared again, and again. Different documents, different dates, always connected to Theo. I leaned back in my chair. For years, Franklin had handled nearly all our financial planning. Not because I couldn't, because he enjoyed it. I trusted him completely, maybe too completely. Now I was beginning to realize there were entire sections of our financial life I knew very little about. The next morning, I decided to call Theo's office. Not to cancel our appointment, to confirm it. The receptionist immediately recognized my name. "Mr. Mercer is expecting you, Mrs. Blackwell." Expecting me? The phrase felt oddly significant. "When exactly is the appointment?" I asked. "January 21st at 2 o'clock. 3 weeks away. Still 3 weeks away." For some reason, that felt like forever. Before hanging up, I asked one more question. "Can you tell me what the meeting is about?" There was a brief pause. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Blackwell." Her voice remained polite. "Mr. Mercer asked that he discuss everything with you personally." Everything. Not one thing. Everything. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. Outside, the winter wind rattled against the windows. Inside, my thoughts raced. Garrett was suddenly discussing my future housing arrangements. Vanessa seemed unusually confident. Russell had overheard references to a plan. Franklin's documents pointed toward a trust, and Theo wanted to discuss everything in person. Individually, none of it proved anything. Together, it felt like the beginning of a much larger story, a story Franklin may have anticipated long before anyone else. And as January 20th approached, I found myself wondering a question that wouldn't leave my mind. What exactly had my husband put in place before he died? And why did it feel like the answer was about to change everything? January 20th arrived with gray skies and freezing rain, the kind of Ohio weather that seeps into your bones. I barely slept the night before, not because I was afraid, because I was tired of not knowing. For nearly a month, questions had been piling up around me. Sophie's warning, Russell's conversation, Garrett's sudden interest in my living arrangements, the mysterious documents Franklin had left behind. Each piece seemed connected to the others, but I still couldn't see the full picture. By 1:30 in the afternoon, I was driving downtown toward Theodore Mercer's office. The building stood in an older section of Columbus. Red brick, tall windows, the kind of place that seemed untouched by time. Franklin had brought me there once years ago. I remembered sitting beside him in the lobby while he joked about lawyers charging by the minute. The memory made me smile. For a moment, then it faded, because Franklin wasn't beside me anymore, and whatever I was about to learn, I would have to face alone. As though this meeting had been waiting for me, not the other way around. Theo stood when I entered his office. He looked older than I remembered. His hair was almost completely gray now, but his eyes remained sharp, kind, steady. The same eyes Franklin trusted for decades. "Lorelei." "Hello?" "Theo." He walked around his desk and embraced me gently. "I'm sorry it's under these circumstances." I nodded. "So am I." For a few moments, we talked about Franklin, old memories, old stories, the kind of conversation two people have when they're both missing the same person. Then Theo became serious, very serious. He opened a large file resting on his desk, a file with my name on it. Lorelei Blackwell. My heart immediately began beating faster. Theo noticed. "Don't worry." That was easy for him to say. He wasn't the one sitting across from a folder that apparently contained answers to questions he didn't even know to ask. Theo folded his hands. Before Franklin passed away, he updated several estate planning documents. I listened carefully. He wanted to ensure you would always be protected. The word protected immediately caught my attention. Protected from what? That's one way to describe him. Theo smiled. He believed preparation was an act of love. That sounded exactly like Franklin. Always fixing problems before they happened, always thinking 5 steps ahead. Financial summaries, legal records, pages and pages of information, far more than I expected. My eyes widened. I had no idea. Most people don't. Theo adjusted his glasses. Franklin preferred it that way. For nearly an hour, he explained how various accounts had been organized. Investments, property holdings, insurance structures. Everything carefully arranged. Everything carefully documented. Franklin had planned far more than I ever realized. Then Theo reached for another document. This one was different, much different. His expression changed slightly before he slid it across the desk. There's something else. The room suddenly felt very quiet. I looked down at the paper. Theo nodded. You weren't supposed to. My pulse quickened. What does that mean? Theo leaned back. This trust became fully active only after Franklin's passing. Looked back at the document. The numbers alone were startling. Properties, investment accounts, business interests, assets I barely recognized. The total value was far larger than I expected. Far larger. I slowly raised my eyes. Theo? He nodded. Yes. I swallowed hard. For a moment, I couldn't find the words. Not because of the money, because of the realization that Franklin had spent years quietly preparing for a future he knew he might never see. Legal term sounded harmless. It wasn't. I could tell immediately. Theo turned several pages, then stopped. His finger rested beside a paragraph. Franklin added this less than 6 months before his death. I began reading. The more I read, the colder I felt. Not from fear, from disbelief. The provision addressed family conduct, specifically, treatment of the surviving spouse, me. I looked up. Theo. He nodded slowly. Franklin was concerned. Concerned about what? Theo's answer came quietly. That some people might treat you differently once he was gone. The words hit harder than anything else I'd heard that day, because they sounded impossible, and yet recent events suggested otherwise. Theo watched me carefully. Then he said something I will never forget. Franklin didn't just leave instructions, Lorelei. He paused. He left consequences. I had the unmistakable feeling that Vanessa's plan was about to collide with a plan she never knew existed. I stared at the document for several seconds. Then I read the paragraph again. And again. The words didn't change. Franklin had anticipated this. Years ago, long before Christmas dinner, long before Sophie overheard those conversations, long before Russell heard Vanessa talking about her plan, my husband had seen a possibility that I refused to see. The possibility that people behave differently when they believe the person protecting you is gone. I slowly lowered the document onto Theo's desk. What exactly does this mean? Theo folded his hands. It means Franklin created conditions. The lawyer's voice remained calm, measured, professional. He wanted family members to benefit from the trust. I nodded. That part made sense. Franklin loved his family, especially his grandchildren. However, he also wanted accountability. Accountability, another simple word. Another word that suddenly felt very important. Theo opened another section of the trust agreement. Several pages contained detailed provisions. Most were standard legal language. Then he pointed to a specific clause. This section grants authority to the trustee. You? He nodded. And ultimately you. My heart skipped a beat. Me? Yes. I looked down at the document. For years, I had assumed Garrett would inherit everything eventually. That was how most people expected these stories to end. Parents leave assets to children. Children receive them. Life moves forward. Simple. Except Franklin had never been simple. Theo continued. The trust includes behavioral provisions. I almost laughed. That sounded like something Franklin would invent, even from beyond the grave. What kind of provisions? Theo met my eyes. If a beneficiary engages in financial exploitation, coercion, manipulation, or intentional mistreatment of the surviving spouse, distributions may be suspended, reduced, or removed. And when? The room became very quiet. I wasn't shocked by the legal language. I was shocked by how specific it was. Almost as if Franklin had imagined the exact situation unfolding now. Theo seemed to read my thoughts. He worried more than he admitted. I looked toward the large office window. Rain streaked across the glass. Gray January skies stretched over downtown Columbus. What made him worry? Theo hesitated, for the first time that afternoon. Then he answered. Franklin noticed things. I smiled sadly. That sounded familiar. Franklin always noticed things. Small things. Things everyone else ignored. Theo continued. There were several conversations during his final year. My attention sharpened immediately. What kind of conversations? Questions. I frowned. Questions about what? The house. My stomach tightened. The house again. Always the house. The same house Sophie mentioned. The same house Garrett suddenly wanted me to leave. The same house Vanessa apparently discussed late at night. Theo opened another folder. Inside were notes. Not official legal documents. Personal notes. Franklin's notes. I recognized his handwriting immediately. Strong, neat, precise. My chest tightened. Seeing his handwriting felt strangely emotional, as though a part of him had suddenly entered the room. Theo slid one page toward me. I read silently. Several entries documented meetings, phone calls, discussions. Then one sentence caught my attention. Vanessa asked Garrett whether the house should eventually be sold after my death. Lorelei was sitting 10 feet away. Neither seemed concerned about discussing it in front of her. I stopped breathing for a moment. The memory returned immediately. A family barbecue. 2 summers before Franklin passed. At the time, I hadn't thought much about the conversation. Now it felt different. Very different. Another note followed. Increasing focus on assets rather than family. Then another. Monitor future developments. I looked up slowly. Theo? He nodded. Franklin never accused anyone of wrongdoing. I noticed his careful wording. Never accused. Not never suspected. A significant difference. He simply believed precautions were wise. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Theo reached for one final envelope. Unlike everything else, it was sealed. My name appeared across the front, in Franklin's handwriting. For Lorelei, my throat tightened immediately. I recognized the pen, the ink, even the way he wrote the letter L. I hadn't seen that handwriting in 4 years. Theo slid the envelope toward me. He instructed me to give you this only if certain circumstances developed. I stared at it. Certain circumstances. The phrase echoed in my mind. Christmas dinner. The invoice. The conversations about my house. The trust. The provisions. Everything suddenly felt connected. Carefully connected. By a man who knew his time was running out. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. Several pages long. The first lines immediately blurred my vision. Not because they were sad, because they sounded exactly like him. My dearest Lorelei, if you're reading this, it means one of 2 things. Either I worried for nothing, or someone has shown you who they truly are. I swallowed. Theo quietly looked away, giving me privacy. I continued reading. Every line felt like Franklin was sitting beside me again, talking, protecting, preparing. Then I reached a paragraph that made my heart stop. A paragraph about the future, about family, about choices, and about a decision he wanted me to make if the day ever came when loyalty was replaced by greed. By the time I finished reading, I finally understood something. Vanessa thought she was working through a plan, but Franklin had already finished his years earlier, and his plan was far more powerful than anything she could imagine. For a long time after I finished reading Franklin's letter, I simply sat there. The pages rested quietly in my hands. Theo said nothing. He didn't need to. Some moments don't require conversation. They require space. And Franklin's words had given me something I hadn't felt in months. Clarity, not anger, not revenge. Clarity. My husband had understood something before I did. People reveal their character when they think there are no consequences, when they believe the person protecting you is gone, when they assume you've become vulnerable. Franklin had seen that possibility, and he had trusted me enough to handle it if the day ever came. Apparently, that day had arrived. 3 days later, Theo arranged a family meeting. The invitation was simple, a review of estate matters. Nothing more, nothing less. Garrett agreed to come immediately. Vanessa seemed enthusiastic. That alone told me plenty. She clearly believed something favorable was about to happen. The meeting took place on a Friday afternoon. Theo's conference room overlooked downtown Columbus. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The atmosphere felt strangely familiar, like the calm before a storm. Garrett sat beside Vanessa. Sophie's expression was nervous. Caleb looked confused. Darlene had joined me for support. Theo entered carrying several folders. The room grew quiet, very quiet. He began professionally, methodically, explaining trust structures, asset protections, distribution schedules, exactly as lawyers do. For the first 20 minutes, Vanessa looked pleased, confident. She even smiled several times. Then Theo reached the section regarding beneficiary conduct, and everything changed. The smile disappeared. Slowly, completely. Theo explained the provisions Franklin had established, the behavioral conditions, the authority granted to the trustee, the protection mechanisms, no accusations, no emotional speeches, just facts, cold, clear, documented facts. Then he read Franklin's statement, the one attached to the trust, the one discussing respect, family responsibility, and treatment of the surviving spouse. Silence filled the room. I glanced toward Garrett. His face had gone pale. Vanessa interrupted first. There must be some mistake. Theo remained calm. There is no mistake. She shifted in her chair. This isn't what Franklin wanted. Theo slid a signed document across the table. It is exactly what Franklin wanted. The room became quiet again. The kind of quiet that cannot be argued with. Because paper doesn't care about opinions. Signatures don't care about excuses. And neither does the truth. Garrett finally spoke. "Mom?" His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. I looked at him. Really looked at him. For the first time in months. Not as my little boy. Not as the child I raised. But as a grown man responsible for his choices. "You knew." The words came out softly. Not angrily. Just honestly. Garrett lowered his eyes. And that was answer enough. Not once did he deny it. Not once. That hurt more than Christmas dinner, more than the invoice, more than the conversations about my house. Because deep down, I had still hoped he didn't know. Now I knew better. Vanessa attempted to explain, then defend herself, then blame misunderstandings. The story changed every few minutes. But nobody seemed interested anymore. Not even Garrett. Especially not Sophie. My granddaughter sat quietly listening, watching, learning. The way young people do when they witness the difference between character and performance. Eventually, Theo finished speaking. The trust provisions were activated. Future distributions would be reviewed under the conditions Franklin had established. Actions had consequences. Exactly as Franklin intended, the meeting ended shortly afterward. No dramatic shouting, no revenge speech, no triumphant celebration. Real life rarely works that way. People simply stood up, collected their belongings, and walked out carrying the weight of their own decisions. A week later, Garrett came to my house alone, for the first time in years. No Vanessa, no excuses, just Garrett. He stood on my porch holding a small box. Inside were old family photographs, pictures he had taken from storage years earlier. Neither of us mentioned the trust immediately. Instead, we sat at my kitchen table and looked through photographs. The same photographs I had studied weeks before, the ones showing how I had gradually disappeared from the edges of family life. Garrett cried first. Not me, him. And while tears don't erase choices, they sometimes reveal understanding. For the first time, he admitted what I already knew. He had remained silent when he should have spoken. He had chosen comfort over courage. He had failed me. I appreciated the honesty, even if it arrived late. Healing doesn't happen in a single conversation. But sometimes it begins there. Months passed. Spring arrived. The maple tree Franklin planted began growing leaves again. Life moved forward the way it always does. Steadily, quietly, unstoppably. Vanessa was no longer at the center of family gatherings. Sophie's relationship with me grew stronger than ever. Caleb started visiting on weekends. And Garrett slowly worked to rebuild trust. One action at a time. The way trust is always rebuilt. Not through promises, through consistency. On Christmas Eve the following year, my dining room was full. Not because it was perfect, because it was honest. Sophie helped set the table. Caleb carried dishes from the kitchen. Garrett arrived early to help decorate the tree. Outside, snow drifted softly across Columbus. Inside, laughter filled the house. Real laughter, not performed, not staged, real. As I looked around the table, my eyes settled briefly on Franklin's photograph sitting near the fireplace. I smiled. Because in the end, the greatest gift he left behind wasn't money, it wasn't property, it wasn't a trust, it was protection. The kind that lasts even after someone is gone, the kind built from love. And as I raised my glass that Christmas Eve, I realized something important. Family isn't measured by who shares your last name. Family is measured by who protects your place at the table when you're no longer able to protect it yourself. And thanks to Franklin, I finally understood the difference. If there's one lesson I learned from that Christmas, it's this. People don't reveal who they are when life is easy. They reveal who they are when they think you have no power left. For too long, I confused silence with peace, and loyalty with obligation. Franklin taught me one final lesson before he left this world. Protecting yourself isn't selfish, and respect should never be traded for family approval. Today, I no longer chase a seat at someone else's table. I cherish the people who genuinely want me there.